Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stephen Lurie. I am a Research and Policy Associate here at the National Network. Really glad we were able to fill this room because it's going to be a really exceptional panel. Today, we've brought together a diversity of equally great minds to tell you different perspectives on the power of legitimacy in public safety. And the purpose of this is to illustrate what is sometimes thought of or talked about as a complex issue, but really, as those who practice it or study it might call it simple, and something that is rather easy in concept, but quite difficult in practice. And that's the idea of legitimacy and how we build it. So through varying perspectives of perceptions of communities that have high contact with law enforcement, through perceptions of young males who take to gun carrying in places of low legitimacy, through the perspective of internal organizational and procedural justice in police departments, and then through the lens of broadly public safety strategies, will illustrate the power and the pitfalls of embracing or avoiding legitimacy. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Nancy Levine from the Urban Institute, who will do our first presentation and then moderate the rest of the panel with Michael Sierra Revelo from Yale University, Wes Skogan from Northwestern University, and David Thacher from the University of Michigan. We will tell you, as Nancy will moderate, we will do questions after each presentation and then at the end as well. So please be ready to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and I'm too short for this microphone. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be presenting along with such amazing scholars on a really important topic. I'm Nancy Levine. I'm with the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute has the privilege of being the evaluation partner on the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, something I'm sure you've already heard about, and the concepts of which were featured this morning at this morning's plenary. The importance of building trust consists of many components, one of which is changing, transforming law enforcement culture and the way that officers interact with members of the public in a manner that builds trust, and that trust building is dependent on the degree to which the community feels that the police are legitimate keepers of the peace, right? And so in our role as the evaluator of the National Initiative, as we call it for short, because it's way too long to say, we went into each of the communities. Let me pause for a second. Who hails from one of the National Initiative sites? Okay, great. Thanks for joining us. So for some of you, this isn't entirely new, but I think the conversation will be new and hopefully the questions. So we went into these communities and did baseline surveys. So I'm going to just share a little bit about those findings. David Kennedy did a fine job summarizing it this morning, better than I could do, in fact, because I'm probably going to go over with my 10 minutes here. But basically what we wanted to do was not your traditional survey. Your traditional survey aims to be representative. I would probably not get tenure at a university by leading this survey work, and yet this is the type of survey that we think is most meaningful for the work of trust building. Why? Because we're not doing surveys all over a city that includes places that view police favorably because they don't have serious crime problems, because they're not likely to be pulled over by nature of the car they drive or the color of their skin. It's a very different relationship with the police. Now, granted, you can't say that a whole jurisdiction feels a certain way when you do the type of survey we did, which deliberately sampled specific street segments based on mapping of crime data where the violent crime occurred, based on mapping out of demographics to identify neighborhoods and even block groups that had the most heaviest levels of poverty and disadvantage. This is a very different sampling methodology, one that I don't think has ever been done before. And again, I don't know if we'll ever get it published in a refereed academic journal. And yet, this is where the perceptions matter most when it comes to trust building in the context of reducing violence. So, what did we learn? First of all, a little bit about our respondents. Mostly when people of color. That is to be expected given our intentional sampling methodology. Also heavily disadvantaged, another part of our intentional sampling methodology, almost 2/3 below the federal poverty level of GULP, yes, $24,000 a year. But let's cut to the chase. I'm going pretty quickly on this because we have so much to cover here, so many good presentations. I want to give a little opportunity for a question or two after each one, and then even some questions after all the panelists are done. No big surprises here. In these communities, there's a sense that police are not treating them with respect. So some of these questions, wow, I can't see this at all, Stephen. It's super small. Yeah, I can't see the magnifying glass. Oh, is it? Sorry, I'm used to using. Okay, so I'll just wing it. So the types of questions we asked. A lot of questions around how law enforcement officers treat them. Do they explain, this is a basic procedural justice concept, do they explain the reason for the stop, for example, or for any step in the process along the way? Do they give people a chance to tell their side of the story, or do they just kind of assume they know what happened? Do they make fair and impartial decisions? In all of these, if you can see the scale, and I'm not sure how well you can, it's really low. Very low percentages of people agreed with any of these statements representing procedural justice. And now I can't get the slide to move. Oh. Okay. So, legitimacy, the title of this panel. A lot of different questions about whether the police wants the same things that you want in your community, whether the laws that the police enforce represent the morals of the people who reside in the community, whether the police act in ways that are consistent with the residents' own ideas about what is right and wrong. A whole host of questions like this, and again, sadly, very, very low rates of agreement with these questions. We also looked at principles of community policing, whether the police department was actually responsive to the concerns of the community and is authentically engaging community members, as well as whether they hold officers accountable for appropriate conduct in the community. Again, stunningly low rates of agreement, less than 1/3 across the board. And unfortunately, very, very high perceived degrees of police bias, a real sense that people are being treated differently based on the color of their skin, that officers are acting based on their own personal prejudices, that they're misinterpreted and judged based on their race or their ethnicity. Again, and now this is flipped, so this is folks who agree with these statements about bias. Now, this is interesting. We asked a bunch of questions, these are kind of exploratory in nature, about how much people relate to the police. And we found some mixed findings here. The issues of, how comfortable they felt around the police, very low levels of comfort. But this top one I thought was compelling. Now, still not even half of respondents agreed with it, but a substantial portion said, yeah, they could actually imagine being friends with the police officer. And this actually rings true with some anecdotal evidence that we've collected over the years that there could be really good relationships between residents and a specific patrol officer, and yet there's an inherent distrust with the department overall. So you really have to address it at both levels, right? As David referenced this morning, David Kennedy in his plenary, now we're seeing a real flip. So a lot of these communities are maligned for being high crime, right? Heavily disadvantaged, certainly heavily policed. Maybe they just don't agree with the law at all, right? I mean, if they don't believe in police, why should they believe in the law? to the contrary. They absolutely do believe in the law. They believe that laws exist for good reason, that laws should be followed, that a person who disobeys the law, it creates danger in the community. So this is an important piece of the narrative that has to be kept in mind when you're building trust with community members. And also, relatively high degrees of willingness to partner with law enforcement, despite everything else I just shared with you, despite how they feel like, in general, officers behave in biased manners, that they're disrespectful, that the police agency overall doesn't hold officers accountable, and yet they still want to report crimes. Most are willing to report suspicious activities, help find a suspect, and lower but still meaningful percentage of respondents said that they would attend a meeting to discuss problems or help to solve a crime even. So that is very promising, except for what isn't is that I have 1 minute left. But guess what? I'm at my last slide. Big caveat in everything I just shared with you. All of this is aggregated across 6 cities. Some cities rated better on some metrics than others. This graphic illustrates the range and the averages. And you can see that this is the range of averages for each of these metrics combined, and then the average across each range. So the averages are low, and so what I've just shared with you is representative across the 6 cities, but each city we found had its own strengths and areas in need of improvement and trust building. So it's important to keep in mind. And different agencies had different strengths and weaknesses. So I'm going to pause here and set a good example for my panelists. I made it right in 10 minutes. I didn't cover a lot of stuff I'd like to. And I welcome 2 questions, and then we'll move on, and then we should have time at the end for even more questions. Any questions? Oh, come on, y'all. Don't make me feel bad. It was that great. Thank you. Yes. Researcher question. From one academic to another. Other questions? Oh, yes.
Yeah, I was looking, so it's something that I think is a general weakness with policing research writ large, is we always ask about perceptions and what would you do. Do you have any sense of actual observable behaviors related to things like cooperation with the police?
That is such a good question. That would be something like calls for service and seeing whether those change over time in response to the interventions associated with the national initiative. And we will be doing some analyses of those types of administrative data. But I don't know how detailed we'll be able to get. And issues like calls for service are kind of a mixed bag, right? Because we don't know if they're representing an increase in crime or an increase in the public's willingness to report crime. So it's a little thorny, but that's a very good question. We'll keep it in mind as we move forward. All right, can I get one more question? Yeah. Oh, okay. The cities were part of the national initiative. That was a collaborative process between John Jay, who leads the initiative, and the Department of Justice. Was that your question?
No, that's not my question, but I was kind of thinking on the range of, how people who, let's go with domestic violence, where women who are victims of domestic violence tend to not want to prosecute or store. I mean, it kind of seems like this is somewhat in the same way where the people who don't like the police, don't trust the police, but it's still able to be true. So it's kind of...
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. Yeah, it's hard to know what's going on there, but yeah. Thank you. All right, well, if you have more questions, I'll entertain them later. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who's going to tell us more about issues of youth perception.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Again, my name is Michael Sierra-Arevalo. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at Yale, so almost a doctor, but not quite yet. This talk is about legal cynicism, which is probably a term you've heard about today. It's very closely related to what legitimacy is. A lack of legitimacy, generally speaking, is indicative of legal cynicism and vice versa. But my question is a little self-serving, or the question I posed to Nancy was because this project was trying to look at an observable behavior, try to find a concrete outcome for what happens when you don't trust the police or when the police do not have legitimacy. And so to that end, this project takes place in Chicago and is looking at the effect of legal cynicism, and I'll get to that in more detail as to what that is, and its effect on protective gun ownership among a very particular population, which is active offenders in Chicago. Protective gun ownership, for our purposes, is protective ownership of a weapon to protect against other people. And unsurprisingly, this is related to a fear of crime, to past victimization, as well as to actual levels of crime. Additionally, it's related to the police. When the police are perceived to be not terribly effective at their job, i.e. keeping citizens safe, people are more likely to own weapons for protection, and also the actual number of officers, so a more empirical measure of the strength of the police is also related to owning a firearm for protection. Despite the fact that crime has been going down for several decades, violent crime and property crime alike, protective ownership is actually more common today than it was 20, 30 years ago. This is a survey done by the Pew Institute, and found that there was an almost doubling of the percentage of gun owners reporting that protection was the primary reason for owning their weapon. A more recent study by Harvard and Northwestern University, when you change the question just a little bit and say, well, what are some of the primary reasons, that number looks like 63% of individuals mark protection from other people specifically as one of the main reasons for owning their firearm. Now, this past work that I was highlighting here has one key flaw, and is that it tends to focus on legal gun ownership or low-risk firearms and their owners. These owners tend to be white, rural, and they tend to be older. We're not talking about young black or brown men in the inner city. And generally speaking, these are the same individuals that are not terribly likely to answer surveys. So, these individuals that I'm talking about here, these more high-risk firearm owners, generally are residing in these disadvantaged minority neighborhoods. You can call them high crime, you can call them disadvantaged. I'm going to refer to them as disadvantaged minority neighborhoods. As Nancy has described, these have higher rates of crime, both violent and property. There's an intense concentration of gun violence in particular, both geographically in terms of the neighborhoods, and even within those neighborhoods. It's not the entire neighborhood, it's particular street corners, it's particular stores. And that violence is sticky in the sense that it stays there year after year after year. And in fact, it can be sticky amongst those populations as well. It's not just one person who's shot, it's that person, and that person's cousin, and that person's cousin's cousin. The same neighborhoods where we have this violence, unsurprisingly, are also places where we see a concentration of police activity. There are more stops, there are more arrests, there are more uses of force, and there's a concentration of police misconduct. All combined, despite the fact that we have more police activity in these places where there is more violence, there also is a lower homicide clearance rate in these same places. I believe the figure from this morning that was cited was that while the homicide clearance rate is low in these places, for homicides, when you look at actual shootings, it's in the single digits. So what we end up with are communities that are generally over-policed and underprotected. Unsurprisingly, residents in these communities often exhibit a sort of lens, a cultural orientation that is called legal cynicism. And I'll borrow from people far smarter than myself. This is defined as a cultural orientation in which the law and its agents of its enforcement are viewed as illegitimate, unresponsive, and ill-equipped to ensure public safety. Put a little bit more simply, legally cynical people don't think they can trust the police. They think the police don't want to help them. And assuming that they think the police even do want to help them, they can't. They don't understand how to effectively provide for their safety. And now, this orientation, this is about perception, but these perceptions have very real consequences. And one example is from Chicago. On April 12, 2013, Robert Tate was shot in the chest outside of this home. This is 921 North Avers. He was lying bleeding on the ground. Paramedics were trying to save his life, and a Chicago officer found him and recognized that the kid probably wasn't going to make it. He asked him, "Do you know who shot you?" Robert looked at the officer as he was dying and said, "I know, but I ain't telling you shit." he died on the sidewalk. They have not found his shooter, as far as I know. This is a very particular example, but it speaks to a much larger issue. There are very real consequences to legal cynicism. This is an example of what's often known as stop snitching, or non-cooperation. A large body of work in sociology shows that young men of color in particular will avoid the police at all costs, but not just police, but also other institutions where they might be surveilled or where the police might be, such as hospitals and schools and banks, things that we know are really important for becoming integrated into society and for being a productive member of that community. Third, there's just general noncompliance in disrespect. You don't do what the police say if you don't believe they have the right to tell you what to do, and if you don't think they're there to protect you and protect your interests. And fourth, and this is where we're going to actually really focus on right now, is the use of violence. Eli Anderson spoke in his seminal book, The Code of the Street, about why violence gets used by young men in places where the law can't be counted on, and where in fact the law and its agents, like the police, are perceived to be victimizers, not protectors. So focusing on this, I wanted to look at the particular behavior related to gun violence, where this violence as self-help is used. So the Chicago Gun Project was a survey that was done in 2006, 2007, which collected data on 141 individuals recently released to probation or parole in the neighborhoods shown on the right. These neighborhoods are actually police beats. The sample is composed of people 17 or older. They all have at least one arrest for a violent crime of some sort. Many of these are gun crimes. They all were out on probation or parole for less than 6 months at the time data was collected, and 42% of the sample reported that they had at some point been in a group that many would consider a quote-unquote street gang. By active offenders, that operationalization in terms of the study, within 6 months of the data being collected, 50% of the sample had recidivated. These were individuals that continued to offend after they released. Now, moving a little more quickly through this, how did I operationalize or measure protective ownership? We didn't have hard measures in terms of like, when did you get the last gun? Or like, can I see it? Because they're not going to tell you. So we asked, have you ever possessed a firearm? Yes or no? And then why did you acquire the most recent one that you had? If they said that they had ever possessed a firearm, they were listed as owners. And then they were just asked about why they had the most recent one they have. Theoretically, they could have had a dozen firearms. We can't disentangle that based on the survey instrument. Secondly, legal cynicism was based off 4 survey items, looking and asking about their perceptions of the police. These are some of the traditional measures used by work by Tom Tyler on respect. Questions like, most police in my neighborhood are dishonest. Most police do their job well. Most police treat people with respect. Took those answers, combined them, and we have a measure of what I call legal cynicism. We control for a variety of things that general social science research controls for. Now, so for our findings, which is where the meat is, 83% of the individuals in the survey reported that they had their most recent firearm for protection. So the survey is showing that the rate of protective ownership in this sample is higher than even the national averages. Second, this just to draw your attention, we see this splash of numbers is just to say that perceptions of police and legal cynicism is significantly related among the people who reported ever having a firearm, that they got it for protection. If you believe that the police are not there to help you, if the police lack legitimacy, you are more likely to have acquired your most recent firearm for protection. I then add in a potential counter-explanation. Well, maybe it's just because they were victimized. It has nothing to do with police. It's just because they got shot or they got robbed sometime in the past. Adding in that variable, there is no change in the effect. We still have significance of legal cynicism on the probability of owning a firearm for protection, even if you've been victimized. That's not what's driving this behavior. It's a perception, at least as these numbers indicate, that the police can't protect me, I have to protect me. And so, just to summarize again the findings, higher rates of protective ownership among this population of people in the national average, lower police legitimacy or higher levels of legal cynicism are related to a higher probability of protective gun ownership, and this is not explained by prior victimization among this population. So in my last 30 seconds, so what? It's important to recognize that this is not just about changing perception, it's not just rhetoric. There can be concrete benefits to enhancing the legitimacy of the police directly related to gun violence and directly related to victimization. So when we start talking about ways to do this, there is a large body of literature and a lot of people, and a lot of them are in this room, trying to figure out ways of doing policing that can enhance this legitimacy. And some things to think about moving forward in the questions is community-oriented policing, whatever that means. It's a very amorphous subject that gets done a variety of ways in a variety of different places and to varying degrees of success. Procedural justice, enhancing the way in which police are perceived to be fair and to be impartial. And lastly, focused deterrence, which actually melds some of these various things together. You're cooperating with the community. You're identifying a particular problem. And you are doing it in a way that can enhance its legitimacy with respect and through the other things that we know affect how people perceive police and the application of the law. Thank you.
Well done. You want to take questions from there or there? Okay. We have any questions for Michael?
Just from my personal experience, any young man I've arrested with a firearm on him, if he's willing to talk to me, the reason he had it is protection. And that's what they say. He's not going to tell me it's wrong with it. So is that part of the question you would ask? Is it a crime?
Yeah, so that's actually that's one of it's a few slides back. So to be fair, I could give them the option to say it's to commit crimes, but there's not a lot of people, particularly amongst probationers and parolees, who have already had negative contact to some degree, that are going to tell a surveyor, I definitely got my last gun. I definitely had that one to rob people. It's definitely part of it. There is a question though as to how much of owning that firearm is for the protection. Is it for status? Is it to commit crimes? It's difficult to say based on the survey. Prior victimization was asking them, have you been a victim of a violent crime? And I mean, the obvious problems are, it just depends on whether or not you felt victimized. Some people who are involved in illegal activities, call it drug dealing or robbing or something of that nature, they may have totally been the victim of a violent crime, but they don't see it as being a victim. That's just kind of what happens. That's street rules. They may not view themselves as victims. So that's one potential limitation. But the variable itself is that it's relatively simple.
With regard to police legitimacy, maybe did you look at, or do you think there's a need to look at, after that these people age out, the older population that were prior criminals but now are no longer involved in criminal activity, that live in the same community? Are they still carrying weapons for protection, which would then enhance your theory that it's because of a lack of legitimacy for the police?
So to summarize, did we find people who are no longer actively offending, and what do we know about them? Sure. So the average age in this sample was actually around 30. So these are not the prototype. It's not that image that you have in your head of a young corner kid. These are people that have done their time and are out. And again, and I do want to be honest about it. I don't have a concrete measure of like, do you have a protective firearm right now? I'm approximating that based on have you ever had one and why did you get the most recent one? The simple answer is that it's very difficult for us to say. We don't actually have a lot of good work on active carrying, particularly amongst a population that's not, say, gangs or people that are in prison. How it affects the behavior of people that are just trying to get by, that are just trying to go to work. Do they carry their firearms more often? Or do they have protective firearms more often than, say, other neighborhoods? I think it's an open question, and there's good evidence and there's good reason to suspect that, yeah, they might. But I can't say for sure based on this survey.
Okay, we're going to save the rest of the questions for later. Invite Wes Skogan to not come up to the podium.
Thank you. I'm being an old fella, I like to be at my leisure. Next question is, how do I get to the next? The other direction. Let's go this way? Yep. There we go. So, the problem is, there's no secret that we have a legitimacy crisis when it comes to the views of many people about the police. Views of the police have always been polarized. They're more polarized now than before by social class, by education, and by race. That's always a continuing problem. So the question is, how do you create and maintain public trust and confidence? And part of the solution, we think, is to encourage fair, respectful, and lawful policing. And I want to talk today about how to do that. By that I mean, for example, economy and the use of force, and responsiveness to community concerns, and accountability for decision-making. And with the goal being public cooperation with the police that's driven by legitimacy. That is the belief it's your duty to obey, it's your obligation as a citizen, and because you respect the police. And when that drives public cooperation, you're in pretty good shape. One of the mechanisms for doing this, which is pretty widely discussed, and I'm sure most people in the audience have heard of it, is procedural justice, which is a body of experience and research on how to handle people, under a variety of circumstances. It's best known in terms of how to handle members of the public, how to manage encounters that take place when the police stop people, issue a citation, respond to calls from victims, deliver emergency services on the street, all the things that they do that bring them into encounters with the public. And the idea is that handling these encounters following the principles of procedural justice will help build trust and confidence and legitimacy. That's not so much my topic today. My topic today rather focuses on the insides of organizations and the role of what I'm going to call organizational justice, just to keep a language that keeps us straight. But organizational justice has to do with the application of procedural justice principles within organizations. And this has been studied in a broad variety of organizations, ranging from FBI agents to military officers, private corporations of many kinds and sizes, the staff of nonprofits and service organizations. There have been many, many studies of what I'm going to call organizational justice, and the many positive and negative things that might come of it as a result. So the two dimensions of procedural or organizational justice are, first of all, fairness and interpersonal treatment. So stuff like treating people with dignity and respect, I think, captures that dimension pretty well. And then fairness in decision making. That is, decisions are neutral, they're based on facts, not the biases of the decision maker. The bosses can explain why they made the decisions they did, that is, they can be accountable for them. And that the decisions are rule-bound. They're in accordance with the procedures and rules of the organization. Just to make this a little more concrete, let me show you a picture of what I'm going to call a broken organization. And this is an organization where internal procedural justice has collapsed. This is called the Chicago Police Department. And this is a survey of patrol officers working in the districts in Chicago. And this slide focuses simply on one part of organizational fairness and organizational decision making, which is the career system. There's nothing more important in an organization than the career system. How you get a job, how you get promoted, how you get ahead, how you get desirable assignments, that's the career system. And what you're seeing here, they were asked these questions in a whole variety of ways, but I've classified the officers as either being happy or unhappy in the story that you're telling me. And what you see is a pretty sad story. How do you get ahead? It's connections. How do you get promoted? It's friends and relatives in high places. How do you get a desirable district assignment? Well, politicians play a big role of that, actually, in Chicago. So that this is what happens when an organization is broken internally when it comes to fairness and decision making, and you get a sullen workforce. You can't imagine the levels of cynicism about leadership and about the role of politicians in the organizations when this is how they see the very structure of their lives, the career system that they live in, being a broken organization. Okay, too bad for Chicago. Why do we care? Well, one reason we care is because there's a growing body of research on the relationship between the quality of the organization and how it interfaces with the public, with the customers, and with the clients. In the private sector, we study customers and clients. In the public sector, we talk about crime victims, and we talk about people who call the police and people who are stopped. But there are numerous linkages between the internal health of the organization, the extent of organizational justice, and their public-facing relationships with the public, or classic procedural justice. Just to give one little example, the dotted lines are consequences of OJ. Here's a consequence of OJ in Chicago, which is support for the police union. Chicago officers who think that their organization is broken also believe that the union is the only thing that they have that stands between them and mistreatment by management. And when that's the situation, and when as many officers are disaffected as you've seen, what you get is very strong officer support because they're being, in very real ways, protected by the union and not by much else. So the internal organizational justice itself has consequences, but it also resonates in terms of how it is that officers stand to deal with the public. Here's a little summary of some of the good things that may come from good internal justice, internal organizational justice. These are the payoffs for the organization. There's at least some police research on all of this, but there are many other studies of other kinds of related organizations that go along with these findings as well. That when the organization itself is healthy, employees are more responsive to management and policy. They're more likely to follow the rules and obey the supervisors. There's less internal deviance, especially in the private sector, theft, and in the public sector, abuse of medical leave, absenteeism, and tardiness all go down when the organization is healthy. There's increased job satisfaction. There's a lot less cynicism regarding the organization as leaders, and less tension and stress. For police officers in particular, I think the biggest source of officer stress is their organization. While the dangers and risks that they face and the excitement of the stress, the things they encounter in the street are definitely strong, their own organization aggravates them in continuous and nagging ways and is a big source of stress. Good things that may come externally because of OJ, because of its relationship with the effectiveness of the organization internally, is first of all more support by officers for the principles of procedural justice. Encounters on the street are highly discretionary, so what officers believe, what they think about how they should be dealing with their workload is important. And what we find is that support for listening, for explaining, for respecting, for being even-handed when you're dealing with the public is much greater when officers come from a healthy organization where they experience those same kinds of relationships internally. There's less tolerance for the use of force in that link between OJ and PJ. That link is one of those little boxes that I've got there. And the strong little box is officers saying that they should go along with the policies of their organization even if they don't like them, okay? So even if they don't like their use of force policy, it's the policy. And my supervisors are enunciating the policy, and I go along because it's a healthy organization. Officers in healthy organizations are more likely to endorse service styles of policing, the importance of being responsiveness to the public and public demands, and they're much more supportive of what I call externally facing reforms, things like community policing. How do we get organizational justice? Well, it's no different from anything else, actually. Culture change. I'm going to focus on leadership and vision. You never see a police department's mission statement that's a bad mission. They don't have bad missions. They have good missions, okay? The whole trick is the organization actually aligned behind the mission? Does it recognize the behaviors that it wants, and does it reward the behaviors that it says it wants? It's getting the organization aligned behind its formal values that's the trick of leadership. And so one way to push organizational justice is through leadership and vision. There's some role for rule tightening, which is the usual response to trying to reform police departments, stressing adherence to guidelines and standards. But as a big city police chief once told me, he said, Wes, he says, remember, he says, we can't kick their asses till they're nice to people. You have to have other mechanisms besides rule tightening to get at this kind of organizational change. What are the barriers? The barriers, the list is equally long. In my survey work in Chicago, police cynicism and the dimensions of cynicism, solidarity, isolation from the community, all this undermines many of the reforms and many of the principles of procedural justice. CompStat, performance measures, don't measure what matters when it comes to this, and it's a big and recurring problem. And then finally, I just want to say that polarization over confidence in policing and the decline in confidence in policing is not just a policing phenomenon. Just to make the problem bigger, it is a nationwide phenomenon. We've been doing national surveys since the late 1930s. And when it comes to questions about government in Washington and my representatives in Washington and the politicians who represent me, we are at an absolute low of 70 years of this kind of stuff. The loss of trust and confidence is a system-wide collapse in trust and confidence, not just the police. So while we work in our own little corner, our own little domain, there's much larger forces that are at work here, which we also have to really try to take into account. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Well done, Wes.
Well, leadership is a problem in all kinds of organizations, but in police departments in particular. Constant turnover, the average chief lasting 3, 4, 5 years. Senior people typically leaving when they're about 50, carrying with them all their experience. It's the hardest thing about studying police is they go. I've been at this a long time. I've seen rookies retire. And so that sustaining initiatives across leaders, sustaining initiatives across regimes in the organization, across mayors, is really, really important. Sergeants, however, I always like to tell sergeants that they're the most important people in the organization, and they like to hear it. But it's true. The guys up in the front push the, you use the shift and push the gas, but it's the sergeant that links it to the wheels and makes it really happen on the street. So a big focus on mid-level managers and sergeants, it seems to me, it's really important. They're the ones who often get shortchanged. We do procedural justice training for line officers, but of course the important people in the white shirts are much too busy, and so they don't get the same kind of attention. So I think that focus on sergeants and mid-level managers is actually, in some ways, the most critical. Back there. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'll try to think of of one particular department. Charlotte Mecklenburg would be an example of one of those, for example. One problem with Chicago is it's too big. I mean, in Charlotte, everybody can get in the same room with a whiteboard and spend a half a day, and everybody's on the same page. Okay, it's in the giant organizations. It's really, really hard. Certainly, the NYPD, however, which is even bigger, scores very well on lots of these dimensions. So, a good, professionally run police department can be a terrific place. One last question.
Wes from Chicago.
Oh, hi, Victor. Victor and I were on a committee together.
I know some of this information was shared with Chicago Police Department.
Yes.
What has been their response, and if they have not, what reason have they given?
Well, I did brief the chief of police and his number one person within the department, and then they were promptly fired by the mayor. So leadership turnover is a continuing problem. I've also given this talk to the exempt staff, which is 125 people who run the place. It was a much longer talk about lots of other things, and it was a little depressing, I think. I also have data to compare Chicago with 14 other big cities, and the problem is that Chicago comes in first if it's a bad measure and last if it's a good measure on almost every one of these dimensions. So it's not just that police are complainers. Comparatively, Chicago is really in a bad state. But now there's been a turnover. We've got new leadership, new priorities. Procedural justice training has come to a halt, and so things aren't good.
And on that note, we will invite David Thacher to the podium to talk about ways that you can engage the community, right?
That's right. Okay.
All right.
I was promised I'd have light.
Yes. And,
well.
And maybe we can circle back to unions while he's
opening the curtains is the only light I will shed today.
Later
no,
on.
I'm
I want to
be
hear more about
optimistic.
unions.
Do it.
Right ahead.
Great. See, isn't that nice?
Uh-huh.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Stephen, for putting together this interesting panel, which has been really fascinating. I think Nancy and Michael, gave us a really great background on this issue of trust and legitimacy and the importance of fairness in policing. And Wes has talked a little bit, and some others have talked a little bit as well about the current idea in good currency about how we deal with issues of legitimacy and improve the fairness of policing, which is this idea of procedural justice. And I'm going to be the contrarian here and say that as important as procedural justice is, it's not enough, and talk a little bit about what I think the procedural justice frame leaves out. I think we also, in addition to this idea of procedural justice, need to be guided in policing and in community activism around policing, need to be guided by a different way of thinking about what fairness and legitimacy involve, that is focused on substance, not just procedures, focused on controlling especially the use of police discretion, which I think, as I understand it, is at the heart of what the focused deterrence model that the National Networks is best known for is really about. And so I think the way to explain what I mean by all this, short of reading you the whole 20,000 word law review article I wrote about it last fall, I'll spare you that, is to start with the problem that is sometimes called over-criminalization, which is an issue that everybody from the Heritage Foundation on the right to the ACLU on the left has been talking about. And the issue is that the criminal law in the United States, as everyone in this room certainly knows, is incredibly broad today, and it covers an incredibly wide range of behavior. We can think, for example, of the traffic code, when most of us could legally be pulled over by the police at any time because almost nobody can drive 3 blocks without breaking some law. And that's not just an issue of the traffic code, it's an issue in lots of other areas of law as well. The late, great William Stuntz, the Harvard law professor, once wrote, only partly tongue-in-cheek, that we seem to be coming, quote, ever closer to a world in which the law in the books makes everyone a felon. And that's not the fault of anybody within the justice system. It's something that our legislators brought to us. But what it means is that the police and prosecutors and the rest of the justice system have enormous discretionary authority. The task for police and prosecutors can't possibly be understood as the task of just enforcing the law, as Chuck Ramsey put it this morning. The task that police and prosecutors and others need to be working on is the task of using this enormous discretionary authority that the law gives them in a responsible and transparent way. And that's a question about substance, not process. It's about being restrained and careful about who is subject to legal authority, who gets stopped, who gets cited, who gets arrested and punished, in what circumstances, not just how they get treated in the process, but what the outcomes of criminal justice attention is. When he explained procedural justice to the public, Chicago Police Commissioner Gary McCarthy often said, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. What I want to say is that what you do matters an awful lot. I want to push back against Gary McCarthy's aphorism there. But the good news is that the anti-crime strategies we're talking about here at this conference are especially good vehicles for using legal authority in a more responsible way. And in fact, it's sort of in the DNA of Operation Ceasefire and related projects that the National Networks has been involved in. And here I want to spend just a couple of minutes on the short history of the focused deterrence model to illustrate what I mean by that. Many people in this room probably know that the focused deterrence model and ceasefire in Boston in the 90s was connected to Herman Goldstein's broader idea of problem-oriented policing. You probably know that focused deterrence was an application of problem-oriented policing in mid-1990s Boston, and later to other problems like overt drug markets in High Point, North Carolina. What's less well known is the history of problem-oriented policing itself, which more than anything else grew out of an effort to grapple with this problem of criminal justice discretion and the breadth of the criminal law that I just mentioned. Herman Goldstein actually got his start working on policing as one of the staff researchers of a big project at the American Bar Foundation, a set of studies they did in the late 1950s. It was a huge multi-million-dollar study of what the criminal justice system actually looked like in a few places around the Midwest. And one of the big things that the ABF studies did was to call attention to the breadth of the criminal law and the enormous discretion that it gave to criminal justice officials. And so the question for a generation of police researchers and criminal law scholars became, how should police and prosecutors and other actors within the justice system, how should they exercise all that discretion that they had, given, again, that they weren't just ministerial agents of the law? And especially, how can we avoid the very real possibility that the exercise of discretion will be driven by kind of sub rosa forces, by the police subculture, by pressure from the most powerful segments of the community, by laziness, by the love of overtime pay, by racism, ignorance, whatever. Because in practice, what you had was a situation where political leadership in cities, police leadership, just ignored the extent of discretion and just left it to frontline officers on the beat to make decisions without any real guidance, and kind of, left them out to dry to make these decisions on their own. Herman Goldstein framed the basic problem all the way back in 1967 when he said, quote, "The challenge is to devise procedures that will result in police officers employing norms acceptable to society rather than personal norms in their exercise of discretion." And the first version of that was the attempt to develop written guidelines through some sort of administrative rulemaking process in police agencies. Goldstein himself pushed this idea through his work on the President's Crime Commission in the late 1960s, and later people like Kenneth Culp Davis and Anthony Amsterdam took it up. It's still important today, and there are a lot of people today who've been doing good work on different aspects of the broad guidelines idea, including Barry Friedman's new book, Unwarranted, Sam Walker, especially George Kelling, has done a lot of work on guidelines for police order maintenance. And that strategy was and continues to be an important one, but Goldstein himself took this issue of police discretion in another direction as well. In his own mind, this idea of developing guidelines to help shape the use of police discretion began to morph a little bit in the late 1970s into this idea of problem solving, which looked in a more contextualized but still rigorous and transparent way at how police discretion should be used in particular times and places to deal with particular problems that communities were struggling with, a sort of project-specific strategy for using police discretion more responsibly rather than putting the emphasis on these broader, permanent agency-wide policies. Now, this isn't usually the way we think about problem-oriented policing. We think about it as a crime control strategy, but from this perspective, the whole idea of problem-oriented policing emerged as kind of an approach to structuring police discretion, being more reflective, more principled, and more transparent about the way that police use this very broad authority that lawmakers have given them, so that it is not used haphazardly. And as a descendant of problem-oriented policing, the focused deterrence model has a lot of potential in that respect, and I think a lot of responsibility as well. So we can take, for example, the High Point drug market intervention that most of you are probably familiar with. If you'd asked the police and the prosecutors in High Point before the drug market intervention who was responsible for the overt drug market in the West End that they ended up targeting, they would have gotten it wrong. Individual officers might have made their individual cases well in the sense of they would have made them legally. Certainly they were following the law, but following the law is too weak a constraint. If you step back and look at the broader landscape of cases, you realize that which cases were getting attention prior to the DMI, they were essentially being picked out at random from the very large volume of cases that technically qualify for legal attention. It was only after the working group looked very carefully at it, only after they did real intelligence gathering and review of records, systematically sorted through it all, thought hard about what it all meant, only then did they figure out what was really sustaining the market and how to use their discretion appropriately. Before they went through that exercise, their attention could only be applied haphazardly in the sense that people who were just hangers-on or bit players in the market might be more likely to be arrested and punished than people who were actually at the center of the problem. And that wasn't the fault of the individual officers. It was because there was no broader framework for thinking strategically about how legal authority should be applied. Again, the whole problem with overcriminalization that I've been, circling around here is that the letter of the law applies far more broadly than it can or should possibly be enforced. Neither full enforcement nor kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease enforcement, responding to community pressure enforcement. Neither one of those things draws the kinds of subtle moral distinctions that need to be drawn, but the more careful kind of scrutiny that the working group process and a focused deterrence model is supposed to provide potentially does do those things and can lead to a fairer and more legitimate use of discretionary authority in the process. Whether it actually does that depends on a bunch of things. It depends on who's involved in the working group process. Are you including civil rights leaders as well as prosecutors, youth organizations as well as business associations. It depends on publicity. Are you actually providing people with real notice of the kinds of behavior that will get people in serious trouble? Since the letter of the law doesn't do it, it sweeps too broadly. It depends on analytic care, on making sure that discretionary enforcement decisions are made in a way that's supported by good reasons. And most of all, it depends on taking a moral perspective on the hard choices that have to be made, not just a crime control perspective. It depends on resisting the temptation in these projects to take a kind of no-holds-barred, ends justify the means use of any hammer that you happen to have to stop the violence or the drug dealing. For example, an example I learned from David Kennedy, you could get at the young drug dealer by threatening to evict his grandmother from public housing on the one-strike rule, but you don't do it. There are some levers you just don't pull for moral reasons, and that moral perspective has to be central to the working group deliberations to use discretion in a responsible way. Again, this is, I think, the most important legacy that the National Network's work is carrying on, dating back at least a half a century to this perspective that came out of the American Power Foundation studies that I mentioned. If we want to do policing today in a fair and responsible way and address what I see as the deepest sources of community concern and the deepest threats to police legitimacy, we have to think hard about when it's appropriate to use the discretionary authority that is entrusted to police at all. And focused deterrence, again, as a descendant of this tradition, has a lot of potential to serve as a vehicle for doing that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, keep going back to this idea of a moral perspective, I think, I'm curious, who's bringing in this moral perspective? I know, I assume it varies from community to community, but is it just a matter of community consensus, or is there some interest in getting some consistency between sites? And if that's the case, are we bringing the philosophers to have these conversations? Where is that moral perspective coming from?
By consistency between sites, you mean across different cities? Right. Conducting them? Well, I mean, I think, one of the things that was productive and useful about the shift from the general guideline strategy to the problem-oriented policing model was the ability to be more tailored to local conditions. Because we all know that, whether or not a certain rule should be enforced to the letter or not depends. It's not an abstract question. It's about what is the problem in this particular community. I think a lot of this has to be bottom up and focused on specific neighborhood and city conditions. Though I read a little moral philosophy myself, and I do think it should be. There's a literature, there's a scholarly literature about the focused deterrence model, and one of my worries is that it is, and the reason I wrote my piece last fall was that it did not have that moral perspective as much as I think it ought to. And so I think there's room for it at both levels, I guess is what I'm saying. And at the community level, it's often driven by community activists, but also by progressive police leaders and municipal leaders, and at the scholarly level, moral philosophy.
Other questions for David? Yep.
I'm Terry Howard. I'm the public defender in Palm Beach County. So from the defender perspective, right, one of the concerns I've had with the community policing process, and I'm interested in just whether there's any research or what's shown, is that the familiarity within the community does require then a great deal of discretion, right? When do you turn your back on some crime, when do you not, how are you friendly one moment, arresting the next, and sort of how that lends itself to inconsistency and then distrust ultimately. My friend today, not tomorrow. I was just curious as to whether there was any research on that. I was interested in the comment earlier about just the
well, so, I mean, the issue of just the quantity of police contact, I guess, is what I'm most pushing back on with respect to procedural justice, which again, I think is a very, productive conversation to have, but my worry is that in some contexts, procedural justice, the claim is made that you can make a lot of stops and you can have strong, heavy enforcement, but you have to make sure that the police treat people with dignity and respect and give them voice and so on in the process. As opposed to, no, you really have to think about the quantity of stops and the situations in which you're making stops and the outcomes of the stops. We need to pay attention to that as well. That's the main thing that I'm wanting to stress here, and I think my worry about looking at procedural justice as the leading idea for police reform is that it doesn't get at that substance dimension. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
David, when you were not very far into your presentation and you quoted McCarthy as saying, it's not what you do, but how you do it.
Yes.
I had this thought of a quote that I have on a little sticky note on my desk, and I look at it all the time, and it's by none other than Herman Goldstein.
Yeah.
And he says, there's such a thing as lawful but awful.
Yep.
And I think that's partly what you're getting at here. It was so interesting that that quote came to mind, and then you went on to talk about Herman Goldstein and his work.
Yeah. Well, that's, Herman's, one of the big contributions people don't realize, because problem-oriented policing came later, was the fundamental role he played in helping to bring a whole community of scholars and practitioners' attention to this issue of discretion and how important it was that this idea that police just enforce the law is an oversimplification. I think Chuck Rankin said it as much as anyone to clarify that.
Well, more questions for David, or we can open it up for questions for any of the panelists at this point. We do have
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Yes, in the back.
For David and anybody else to add, regarding to the problem and police discretion, how does the body camera now affect?
I'm sorry.
How does the body camera affect police discretion and the application of the law? That's a good one.
Yeah, I don't want to, if any other people want to.
We're in the middle of a few different evaluations of body cameras at the Urban Institute, but I'm not sure we have a good answer. Yeah, maybe 2 years from now. I mean, I think it's really interesting. The research early on about body cameras was that they have a civilizing effect, that both parties behave better, supposedly. Then research recently in the UK suggests that use of force is higher among those equipped with body cameras. We have some findings that are coming out soon that suggest there's a lot of variation in the degree to which officers activate their cameras, and that those that activate their cameras more are engaging in more proactive policing, and those who do it less are more responding to calls. So that might relate to some of these issues of discretion. But I think the jury's out. We really need to collect a little bit more data on that.
I'll add on. I'm wrapping up a 3-city ethnography of urban policing. So body cameras just come up a lot, and there's variation between departments and which departments have them, to what degree they have them. Their policies are all different. But just so like one example, generally speaking, officers like the idea of having evidence that they're not beating people for no reason. Generally speaking, they like having them. And there have been examples that they give me like of cameras, in their words, like saving my ass. This woman claimed that I assaulted her. Body camera shows I did not. They also, the cameras themselves, they can negatively affect discretion. Insofar as, and this is a concrete example, again, we arrived, it was a very run-of-the-mill domestic incident between a man and his wife. California has it's mandatory arrest, like a lot of states do. If there is violence, really of any kind, there must be a mandatory arrest. This was actually reversed, in which the woman apparently pushed the man's forehead. She didn't beat him. There was no blood. It was relatively mundane, but that's domestic violence by the law. Now, you can imagine a scenario in which an officer arrives at the scene, sees what this is, and is like, okay, I'm not doing anything. Like, you guys can just calm down. Like, maybe can you go stay at your mother's, whatever. But the officer had his camera on, and though he tried to word it 6 different ways to have the man not tell him and tell the camera that his wife did the following to his forehead, there was no shot. And he said, and I asked him later, like, what happened? Like, why are we leading this woman out at 3 o'clock in the morning in front of her toddler in handcuffs? He's like, well, I think, look, it's my job. He said, and I got this right here. Like, I'm making that arrest every time. It's not worth my job. So generally speaking, there are downsides that I think they're not thought about. Much less the issue, of course, taking cameras in people's homes during, sexual violence, things of that nature. Should that be foiable? These are open questions. So yeah, like 2 to 10 years from now, we'll probably have a good answer.
Come back.
If I could just quickly follow up, my biggest worry, I think the body camera can be a good tool, it just depends on how they're used, but the biggest worry is maybe illustrated by this example that the field of view is pretty myopic, and you worry about it, and we all know this from the pending use of force situations where you see the moment when they use force on the video, but you don't see all the lead up to that. And I think these issues that Goldstein and others talk about where discretion needs to be used in a responsible way appropriate to the context. The context is broader than the field of view of the camera, is to put it in an aphorism. And we have to be very conscious of that, or we end up with this kind of perverse response where the officer says, look, I'm just going to follow the rule, even if the broader context that isn't within view of the camera would suggest a different position.
I have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Harold Karen with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives from Local. I've been sitting in the room with both presidents and currently helping the current administration work through the law enforcement strategy. My question is specifically on timing of your last survey. Because one of the things I've seen as we travel around the country and done a number of town halls is the national rhetoric is absolutely having an impact on how safe people feel in their own neighborhoods, assuming that's going to prevail. So I'm just kind of curious if you guys measure that.
Right. So the survey findings I presented were before the election. They were last. I'm looking at Jesse Janetta, my colleague here. Fall of 15? Was that long ago? All right. So anyway, we're getting back in the field in August. We'll have a point of comparison, but I don't know that it's going to tell you a lot because, as you may recall from the beginning of my presentation, it's not a representative sample of everyone who resides in each of these jurisdictions. We deliberately went to areas that folks who have the most fraught relationships with law enforcement reside. So I don't know if it'll be getting at some of those dimensions that you referred to.
I spent time in Oakland after Oscar Grant, because of the Obama message from Charlotte, spent time there, went back to Charlotte after that, after the election, and I can tell you that.
You felt a difference. Yeah. And another thing that we have to be aware of is just, various events that occur and the timing of the survey. If there's, another unfortunate shooting of an unarmed member of the community, and then we're coming in with these surveys, we're going to get some very biased results from that. So there are these history effects that do exist. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, especially so late in the afternoon and staying awake. I think all of you stayed awake, so congratulations on that. And I want to thank my fellow panelists as well as Stephen.
And if you just have one more moment, yes, let's get a big round of applause for the panelists.